all praises, all praises to the heavenly, holy, almighty creator of infinity, eternity, the universe, and all there is. This is Revelations.Unveiled. Detroit. Hello, family. We're back together again in our wonderful consensual assembly, and I am here before you most humbly in the greatest level of honor and privilege to make presentation. And family, my continuous petitions and prayer for the care and safety, the serenity and solace of the 12 tribes of the house of Israel scattered abroad, wherever they may sojourn, as well as my brothers and sisters of the world. And family, we are convocating once again in this holy congregation where we will again sit at the knee of wisdom for our spiritual and secular education and edification. And we will once again dive into the depths of the history of the world and of our people. And today, family, we are considering and pondering the current condition and situation of what is referred to as the motherland, the continent of Africa, the land of Ham, the wilderness, a continent of vast size, of diverse countries and states, of diverse peoples, tongues, and ethnicities, of the greatest inventories of minerals, precious stones, and oils as have been found within the newly excavations and explorations of the various nations. And so, family, what we are learning is that the devastation that has come upon the various nations of this continent was a crafty council. It was a united confederacy by European nations to go into this wonderful continent, divide it up, and exploit it for the resources, the lands, and the people. And so, family, in addition to the overall captivity of the so-called Negro people, the Hebrew Israelites, as they suffered through the sub-Saharan slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, being kidnapped and purged and pilfered globally throughout all of the various ports of the world, the remaining populaces of the original Hamitic people and the remnants of some of the Hebrews suffer the devastation of the current circumstance and condition of the continent. And we shall review how this came to pass and how these lines of financial deprivation and predatory practice are still levied against these people of the land of Ham, of the continent of Africa. And we begin. How does Africa begin to recover from the unfavorable decisions made at the Berlin Conference? After 134 years, the effects still linger. The Berlin Conference of 1884 through 85 still hold much blame for how the continent of Africa lost her rights to lands, natural and human resources, and the power to choose the direction of their individual states. In the beginning of the 17th century, the continent of Africa was still intact and still had few trading posts with the European merchants. The quest for ivory led some Europeans inland. And with this interactions with the interiors of Africa exposed the numerous natural mineral resources scattered over the continent. The Berlin Conference was triggered by a clash of interest between some of the European powers at the time. King Leopold II of Belgium, between 1878 and 1885, secretly sought to organize a nation within the continent. It was to be called the Congo Free State. His plot was discovered by France, and in 1881, France raised its flag over newly founded Brazzaville, which is currently the Republic of Congo. Portugal also laid claim to the Congo area, citing that the Congo was its old colony. France, Italy, Germany, Britain, and Portugal from 1881 found themselves in a battle for control of various parts of Africa. Germany became aggressive and launched its own expeditions. The French and British became scared of the development. So to ease the tensions, King Leopold II of Belgium convinced France and Germany that common trade in Africa would be good for their countries. 13 nations in Europe, including the United States, were invited by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to take part in the Berlin Conference. The conference was of Portuguese initiative and supported by Britain. The European nations were invited to work out a joint policy on the African continent. All who matter was informed of this conference, but Africa and the leaders were not. The lands were to be divided, and those who were not a part of this confederacy did not receive an invitation to state their opinion on the matter. The conference opened on November 15, 1884, and closed on 26 February 1885. The following nations were in attendance: Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire, or current-day Turkey, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It is important to note that the United States reserved the rights to accept or decline the conclusions of the conference. The conference, although it lacked moral grounds, was upheld by these European powers. They made certain resolutions without much concern to the effects of the African inhabitants. The resolutions to date are seen as unfair to the continent and the people. The General Act of the conference saw the abolition of the slave trade. This move was to gain public acceptance for the resolutions of the conference. And of course, who would want to continue slavery when they had discovered resources such as gold, timber, rubber, land, and markets, to mention but a few? After millions of African slaves had been taken to build Europe and America and the Middle Eastern nations, it was then time for Europe to shift its interest to the mineral resources beneath the African continental soil. To reinforce their claim to African lands and property, the Berlin Conference empowered Europe with the principle of effective occupation. The principle stated that the nations involved could acquire rights over indigenous lands only if they possessed them or had effective occupation. This implied that they had to have treaties with local leaders, flew their flag there, and also establish an administration in the territory to govern it with a police force to keep order. They could also make use of the colony for economic purposes. Since after the Berlin Conference and the sharing of Africa, not one African state is progressive. Not one African state has been allowed by the colonizers to reach its full potential. The former colonies of France still pay colonial tax to France without their indigenous central banks, while the former colonies of Britain, such as Nigeria, has been manipulated politically because of its crude oil, among other resources. To date, there are mines all over Africa, overseen by European companies and governments. The proceeds from these mines do not return to the African inhabitants in these states. The resources, the proceeds from these mines do not return to the African states or the people. Instead, it is shared between the corrupt leaders of those states and their foreign counterparts. Africans, or Africa's, abundant minerals are still an attraction for the powers that conferred the Berlin Conference decades after the independence of these nations, so-called. One will be bold to argue that if African kings and leaders were invited to take part in the Berlin Conference, if these African leaders were invited to the conference, maybe things would have turned out better or different for the continent. It is, however, most unfortunate that the richest region in mineral resources in the world still remains the most underdeveloped of all in the world. Many would blame the problems on bad leadership, but some others would tell you that the resolutions of the Berlin Conference are still in effect, and colonization only took a different route. So family, we see, and now we can expand on this premise of the Berlin Conference, where the European nations went into the continent of Africa and partitioned it and set up colonies and trading posts and police force and imposed their economic and military might on the poor people of those lands, and also very easy for them to finance those cooperative to their agenda and their mission and install them in the leadership positions, thus giving a similar face of the people in the positions of power, but they are willing puppets to the colonizers and their agendas to pilfer and profit off of the natural resources of the land. And so, within the political conversations that we have here in America on this continent of confusion, where we speak about the circumstance and the political status and the global status of these African nations, we always are quick to point the finger at the people instead of those invisible powers and principalities which have crafted these demonic devices and machinations of malevolency to impose on the people as they take out the precious resource, the precious soul, the inheritance of the inhabitants. So family, it must be understood that the foundations and the economies and the cultural centers of these Middle Eastern nations and these European countries would be nothing if they did not sit upon the base of the land of Africa and the people that they stole and distributed throughout the earth. And so, family, we shall reconvene in our continuous review of world history and how it applies to us and our spiritual walk as we are continuing to learn and discern the duality of the carnal existence under spiritual examination. And so, until we are together again, I love you. I love you. I love you. This is a review of the Berlin Conference and its continuing current effects on the continent of Africa and its people. This is Revelations.Unveiled. Detroit.